The prison yard always had a certain rhythm: shouting, metal gates slamming, boots scraping in the dust. But that morning, everything fell strangely quiet when the new inmate walked in. Tall, silent, eyes cold like someone who'd already buried parts of himself. A lone wolf. The kind of man who kept to the shadows and didn't belong to any gang, which made him the perfect target. The thugs spotted him instantly. 3 of them, broad and grinning, hungry for a show. "Look what we got here." The leader snorted, blocking his path. "No crew, no colors, no backup." The lone man didn't respond. He just kept walking. Bad move. A fist slammed into his back. Another thug tripped him. The third kicked dust into his face as he hit the ground. Inmates laughed. Guards ignored it. The yard loved blood sport. But then, the man on the ground stood up. Slowly, quietly, and when he raised his head, the laughter stopped. His eyes weren't scared, weren't angry. They were calculating, cold, like a predator studying its prey. Nobody knew it yet. But the man they were tormenting wasn't just another inmate. He was a former Black Ops operative trained to neutralize threats in under 3 seconds. And the thugs had just made the most fatal mistake of their lives. What happened next made the entire yard take 3 steps back. Stay with me until the end, because what he does next in that yard will flip the entire prison hierarchy upside down. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Marcus Kane arrived at Millbrook Correctional Facility on a Tuesday morning, shackled and silent. The transport van pulled up to the concrete fortress, and as the guards processed his paperwork, one detail stood out. His file was mostly redacted. Black bars covered entire sections. The only visible information showed a conviction for assault, 5-year sentence, and a note that simply read, "Handle with extreme caution." The intake officer barely glanced up. Another violent criminal, another number in the system. He handed Marcus his orange jumpsuit and pointed toward the cell blocks. What the officer didn't know was that Marcus Kane had spent 12 years in military special operations before his world came crashing down. The first rule of prison survival is simple. Find your tribe or become prey. Every inmate understands this from day one. The yard is divided into territories marked by invisible lines that only the desperate or the foolish dare to cross. The Aryans controlled the eastern section. The Hispanics claimed the western wall. The blacks dominated the basketball courts. And somewhere in between, smaller groups carved out their own microscopic kingdoms. But Marcus Kane walked into this ecosystem with no intention of joining anyone. His first week passed without incident. He kept to himself during meals, avoided eye contact in the hallways, and spent his free time reading in his cell. The other inmates watched him, trying to figure out where he fit. Was he undercover law enforcement, a snitch, or just another broken man trying to disappear? The answer came when Tommy Briggs decided to make his move. Tommy ran a crew of 5 guys who specialized in extortion and intimidation. They called themselves the Wolves, though real wolves would have been ashamed of the comparison. Tommy had been locked up for armed robbery and had built his reputation by crushing anyone who refused to pay protection fees. He was thick-necked, covered in prison tattoos, and enjoyed the fear he saw in weaker inmates' eyes. When Tommy saw Marcus sitting alone at lunch, reading a philosophy book, he sensed opportunity. A quiet loner with no backup meant easy money. He walked over with his 2 lieutenants, Rico and Blade, and slammed his hand on the table. "You owe us a tax, new boy." Tommy announced loud enough for nearby tables to hear. $50 a week for protection. First payment's due tomorrow. Marcus looked up from his book, studied Tommy's face for exactly 3 seconds, then returned to reading. He didn't say a word. The disrespect hit Tommy like a physical blow. In prison, reputation is everything, and being ignored in public was the ultimate insult. Rico and Blade exchanged glances, waiting for their leader's response. The entire cafeteria had gone quiet, sensing the tension. "Did you hear me, old man?" Tommy's voice rose an octave. "I said you owe us money." Marcus closed his book, placed it carefully on the table, and stood up. He was taller than Tommy by several inches, but that wasn't what made the room suddenly feel smaller. It was the way he moved, fluid, controlled, like a machine built for violence but currently set to standby mode. "I heard you," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The answer is no." Then he walked away. The yard incident happened 3 days later, and by then, Tommy's humiliation had festered into rage. He couldn't let the disrespect slide. Word had spread through the prison that someone had openly defied the wolves, and if Tommy didn't respond decisively, his entire operation would crumble. He planned it carefully. The yard was the perfect stage for a public beating. Guards were minimal, cameras had blind spots, and hundreds of inmates would witness Tommy reasserting his dominance. He brought his full crew this time, 5 men against 1. They found Marcus walking the perimeter alone, as was his habit. The setup was textbook prison intimidation. Surround the target, cut off escape routes, and deliver overwhelming force. Tommy positioned himself directly in front, while his men flanked Marcus from both sides. "Time to pay up, books," Tommy snarled, using the nickname inmates had given Marcus for his constant reading. With interest. What happened next would become prison legend. Marcus stopped walking and slowly turned to face his attackers. For a moment, he looked almost sad, like a teacher disappointed in students who hadn't studied for the exam. Then his expression shifted, and something primal flickered behind his eyes. "You should walk away," he said quietly. "All of you. Right now." Tommy laughed, but it sounded forced. There was something unsettling about Marcus's stillness, the way he stood perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. "You threatening us, old man? You and what army?" "No army," Marcus replied. "Just me." The first attacker came from Marcus's left side. Rico, swinging an improvised shank made from a sharpened toothbrush handle. Prison fights are usually chaotic affairs, all fury and desperation. But what Marcus did next was surgical. He moved exactly 18 inches to his right, grabbed Rico's wrist in a grip that made bones creak, and twisted with mechanical precision. The shank clattered to the ground as Rico's shoulder dislocated with a wet pop. Marcus held him there for exactly 2 seconds, then released him. Rico collapsed, cradling his useless arm and whimpering. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. Blade charged next, throwing wild haymakers that would have flattened most men. Marcus didn't block the punches. He absorbed them, stepping inside Blade's reach and driving an elbow into his solar plexus with devastating accuracy. Blade doubled over, gasping, and Marcus brought his knee up to meet Blade's descending face. The impact echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Blade hit the ground unconscious, blood streaming from his shattered nose. The remaining 3 attackers hesitated. They'd just watched 2 of their crew get dismantled like broken toys, and suddenly the numbers game didn't feel so favorable. But Tommy couldn't back down now. Not with the entire yard watching. Not with his reputation bleeding out on the concrete. He pulled a razor blade from his sleeve, the kind inmates fashion from broken mirrors and taped to pencils. "You're gonna pay for that, freak," he hissed, advancing with the makeshift weapon extended. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying the blade's angle, Tommy's grip, his stance. In that split second, he calculated 17 different ways to end the fight. He chose the one that would send the clearest message. When Tommy lunged forward, slashing wildly, Marcus moved like liquid mercury. He sidestepped the blade, caught Tommy's wrist, and twisted it backward until something snapped. The razor clattered away as Tommy screamed, his hand now bent at an impossible angle. But Marcus wasn't finished. He drove his palm into Tommy's elbow, hyperextending the joint with a sickening crack. Tommy dropped to his knees, cradling his mangled arm. The leader of the wolves, the man who'd terrorized dozens of inmates, was reduced to sobbing in the dirt. The two remaining crew members took one look at their broken leader and ran. Actually ran. Through the yard, past gawking inmates, straight back to their cells where they'd spend the next week, pretending this never happened. Marcus stood over Tommy, not even breathing hard. He reached down, grabbed the crying man by his shirt, and pulled him close enough to whisper. "I gave you a chance to walk away," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Next time someone offers you that same chance, I suggest you take it." He released Tommy, who collapsed back into the dust, and walked away as if nothing had happened. The entire yard remained frozen in stunned silence. Guards who'd been looking the other way suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Even the toughest inmates stepped aside as Marcus passed. What they'd just witnessed wasn't a prison fight. It was a masterclass in controlled violence delivered by someone who'd clearly done this before. Many times. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening count, every inmate knew the story. The quiet guy with the books had just dismantled the wolves in under 30 seconds. But the details kept changing with each telling. Some said he'd killed a man with his bare hands. Others claimed he'd broken Tommy's back. A few swore they'd seen military tattoos when his sleeve rode up during the fight. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. Marcus Kane hadn't even tried. What the inmates witnessed was maybe 10% of his actual capability, like watching a Formula One driver navigate a parking lot. But the aftermath was just beginning. Prison hierarchies don't collapse overnight. They crack slowly, like ice under pressure, until everything shifts at once. Tommy's crew disbanded within hours. Rico was taken to the medical unit with his dislocated shoulder. Blade regained consciousness 3 hours later, with a concussion that would plague him for months. The other two members quietly transferred to different cell blocks, claiming they needed protective custody. Tommy himself became a ghost. His broken arm required surgery that the prison medical staff wasn't equipped to perform, so he was transferred to an outside hospital under heavy guard. When he returned a week later, his reputation was buried deeper than his shattered bones. Inmates who'd once paid him protection money now looked right through him. The man who'd ruled through fear had become invisible. But nature abhors a vacuum, especially in prison. With the wolves neutralized, other predators began circling Marcus, trying to figure out how to use his sudden notoriety to their advantage. The first approach came from Carlos Mendez, leader of the Hispanic inmates. Carlos was smarter than Tommy, more calculating. He understood that Marcus represented either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy, with no middle ground between those options. He found Marcus in the library 3 days after the yard incident, sitting alone at a corner table with a biography of Alexander the Great. Carlos approached carefully, hands visible, posture non-threatening. "Mind if I sit?" Carlos asked, already pulling out the chair across from Marcus. Marcus looked up from his book, studied Carlos for a moment, then nodded. Carlos interpreted this as progress. "That was impressive, what you did to Tommy's boys," Carlos began, keeping his voice conversational. "Word is you've got some serious training. Military?" Marcus returned to his reading without responding. "Look, I respect the strong, silent type, but this is a conversation worth having," Carlos continued. "You made enemies when you took down Tommy. The Aryans are already talking about making a move. They can't let that kind of disrespect slide, especially from someone with no backing." This time Marcus closed his book and gave Carlos his full attention. The Hispanic leader felt a chill run down his spine. Those pale blue eyes were like looking into Arctic water. "You offering protection?" Marcus asked. "I'm offering partnership. You join us, we watch each other's backs. Nobody messes with you, nobody messes with us. It's mutually beneficial." Marcus considered this for exactly 5 seconds. "And if I refuse?" Carlos spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "Then you're on your own when the storm comes. And brother, there's a big storm heading your way." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Join Carlos or face the consequences alone. It was the same choice every inmate eventually faced, dressed up in diplomatic language. Marcus stood up, tucked his book under his arm, and looked down at Carlos with something that might have been amusement. "I've been in storms before," he said quietly. "I'm still here." Then he walked away, leaving Carlos sitting alone at the table, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. That night, as Marcus lay on his narrow prison bunk, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. 6 months ago, he'd been living in a cabin in Montana, trying to forget 12 years of classified operations in places that didn't exist on any map. He'd been Marcus Kane, retired operator, teaching survival courses to weekend warriors and drinking himself to sleep every night. Then Jenny Morrison happened. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Jenny, walking out of that coffee shop in Billings, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun. Jenny, who worked at the local animal shelter and believed everyone deserved a second chance. Jenny, who'd somehow seen past his walls and decided he was worth saving. For 8 months, she'd been his anchor to the civilian world. She'd made him laugh, made him remember what it felt like to be human instead of just a weapon. They'd talked about marriage, about him finally putting down roots somewhere permanent. Then everything went wrong in the span of 36 hours. The phone call came on a Tuesday night while Marcus was grilling steaks on Jenny's back porch. Her voice, breathless and terrified, cut through the evening air like a blade. 3 men had broken into the animal shelter. They were holding her at gunpoint, demanding she open the safe, where the monthly donations were kept. Marcus was there in 4 minutes. What he found was a scene pulled straight from his worst nightmares. Jenny on her knees, tears streaming down her face, while a strung-out addict pressed a pistol against her temple. The other 2 were ransacking the office, searching for anything valuable. He'd tried to negotiate, tried to talk them down, but when the gunman's fingers started tightening on the trigger, Marcus Kane, the civilian, disappeared, and the operator took control. The fight lasted 18 seconds. When it was over, one attacker was dead, another would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, and the third was catatonic from trauma. Jenny was safe, but she looked at Marcus like she'd never seen him before. The gentle man who'd brought her flowers every Friday had just killed someone with his bare hands. The trial was a formality, Self-defense was clear, but the prosecutor painted Marcus as a trained killer who'd used excessive force. The media ran with it, turning him into a cautionary tale about violent veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life. Jenny testified on his behalf, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at him. 5 years for voluntary manslaughter. The judge called it a lenient sentence considering his military record. Marcus called it the end of everything that mattered. Now, lying in his prison bunk, he understood that Millbrook Correctional wasn't just his punishment. It was his purgatory, a place where violent men like him belonged. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd ended up exactly where society thought he should be. But the other inmates didn't know his story. They just knew that the quiet guy in cell block C had dismantled the wolves without breaking a sweat. And now every power player in the prison was trying to figure out how to use him. The next morning brought visitors. Marcus was finishing his breakfast when 3 men approached his table. Not Carlos's crew this time. These guys were different, older, more cautious. They moved with the calculated precision of men who'd survived decades behind bars. The leader was a grizzled black man in his 50s named Jerome Washington. His arms were covered in faded tattoos that told the story of 30 years in maximum security facilities. His eyes held the kind of wisdom that only came from watching countless young men destroy themselves against the unforgiving walls of the system. "Mind if we join you?" Jerome asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. Marcus gestured to the empty chairs. Jerome sat down, while his 2 associates remained standing, scanning the cafeteria for potential threats. Prison etiquette demanded this level of caution during any significant conversation. "Name's Jerome," the older man began, cutting straight to the point. "I run things for the Brotherhood here. Been watching you since you arrived." Marcus continued eating his oatmeal, waiting for the pitch he knew was coming. "You handled Tommy's boys real professional-like," Jerome continued. "That wasn't street fighting. That was something else entirely." "It was self-defense," Marcus replied, his voice neutral. Jerome chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Brother, I've seen self-defense. What you did was tactical dismantlement. You took apart 5 men like you were following a manual." The observation was accurate, which meant Jerome was more perceptive than most inmates. Marcus filed that information away for future reference. "Here's the situation," Jerome said, leaning forward slightly. "The Aryans are planning something big. Word is they're bringing in outside help, maybe even some guards on their payroll. They can't let what you did to Tommy slide, especially since you refused Carlos's offer yesterday." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Prison intelligence networks were faster than the internet. "So you're offering the same deal Carlos offered," Marcus said. "Protection in exchange for loyalty." "No," Jerome replied, surprising him. "I'm offering you information. The Aryans are planning to hit you during tomorrow's yard time. They're bringing weapons. Real weapons, not just shanks and razors." This was new information, and potentially valuable. Marcus set down his spoon and gave Jerome his full attention. "What do you want in return?" Marcus asked. "Nothing right now. Consider it a gesture of respect between professionals." Jerome stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "But Marcus, when this is over, we should talk about the future." Jerome and his men walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The warning felt legitimate, which meant he had less than 24 hours to prepare for a coordinated assault. The smart play would be to request protective custody, spend a few weeks in isolation until things cooled down. But Marcus Kane had never taken the smart play when it came to violence. He'd always preferred to meet threats head-on, to end problems permanently rather than postpone them. Prison hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of his nature. That afternoon, he made his preparations. The commissary sold basic supplies, nothing that could be classified as a weapon. But Marcus had learned long ago that everything was a weapon if you knew how to use it. A bar of soap in a sock became a blackjack. Toothpaste mixed with broken glass created a blinding agent. Even a magazine could be rolled tight enough to crush a windpipe. He spent an hour in his cell, crafting tools from everyday items. Then he wrote a letter to Jenny, though he had no intention of sending it. Writing helped him focus, helped him remember why he was here and what he'd lost. The letter became a meditation on consequences, on the price of violence even when that violence was necessary. By evening count, he was ready. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the prison yard. The tension was palpable from the moment the doors opened. Inmates who usually flooded outside for recreation time moved more cautiously, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Marcus walked to his usual spot along the perimeter fence, but he wasn't alone. Word of the impending confrontation had spread through every cell block, and now hundreds of inmates were positioning themselves to watch the show. Even the guards seemed more alert, though whether they'd intervene was anyone's guess. The Aryans came in force. 8 men approached from different angles, moving with military precision that suggested outside training. Their leader was a mountain of muscle and scars named Viktor Kozlov, a Russian immigrant serving life for racketeering and murder. His shaved head was covered in white supremacist tattoos, and his eyes held the flat stare of a born killer. But it wasn't just their numbers that made this different from the Tommy incident. These men carried real weapons. Marcus could see the outlines of improvised knives tucked into their clothing, could smell the chemical tang of prison-made explosives. Someone had invested serious resources in this attack. Victor stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid Marcus's immediate reach. The other 7 spread out in a loose circle, cutting off all escape routes. It was a textbook kill formation, designed to overwhelm a single target through coordinated assault. "You made a mistake, soldier boy," Victor called out, his accent thick but his English clear. "You think because you know some fancy moves, you can disrespect the natural order here." Marcus remained silent, his eyes tracking each attacker's position, calculating angles and distances. 7 men with knives, at least 2 with what looked like pipe bombs. Multiple guards watching but not intervening. No backup coming. The odds were impossible by any reasonable standard. "My brothers want your head," Victor continued, clearly enjoying his moment of dominance. "But I am reasonable, man. You kneel down, apologize for disrespecting white race, and maybe you only lose few fingers instead of your life." The yard had gone completely silent. Even the guards had stopped pretending to patrol, focusing entirely on the confrontation. This wasn't just another prison fight. This was a public execution designed to send a message to every inmate in Millbrook. Marcus looked at Victor, then at each of his 7 accomplices. He noted their weapons, their stances, their levels of training. Most were street thugs elevated by ideology but lacking real combat experience. 2 showed signs of military background. One had the fluid movements of someone trained in knife fighting. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the entire yard. "I gave your friend Tommy a chance to walk away," Marcus said calmly. "I'm extending the same courtesy to you." Victor's laugh was harsh and guttural. You think this is same as Tommy's? Pathetic crew? We are wolves, and you are sheep pretending to be dangerous. No, Marcus replied, and something in his tone made the entire yard lean forward. You're not wolves. You're just angry children playing with weapons you don't understand. The insult hit Victor like a physical blow. In prison, respect was everything, and being called a child in front of hundreds of witnesses was the ultimate humiliation. His face flushed red beneath his pale skin. "Kill him!" Victor snarled to his men. "Kill him slow!" The attack came from all sides simultaneously, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. But what happened next would become the stuff of prison legend, a story told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. Marcus Kane didn't just fight back. He became something else entirely, something that reminded every witness why certain men should never be caged with ordinary criminals. The first attacker came from his left, swinging a foot-long shank in a wild arc aimed at Marcus's throat. Marcus ducked under the blade, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted with surgical precision. The snap of breaking bone echoed across the yard as the weapon clattered away. Marcus didn't release his grip. Instead, he used the attacker's momentum to spin him into the path of the second assault. Two men collided with sickening impact, both going down in a tangle of limbs and confusion. The knife fighter approached from behind, moving with professional skill. But Marcus had been tracking him through peripheral vision, counting his steps, timing his approach. When the blade thrust forward, Marcus pivoted and caught the attacker's arm, redirecting the strike into empty air. His counterattack was a vicious elbow to the temple that dropped the knife fighter like a stone. 3 down in less than 10 seconds. The remaining attackers hesitated, suddenly realizing they weren't facing a typical inmate. Victor screamed at them to continue, but doubt had crept into their movements. They'd expected to overwhelm a single target through numbers and surprise. Instead, they were watching their carefully planned assault get dismantled by someone who moved like death itself. One of the Aryans produced a pipe bomb, a crude device made from match heads and metal shrapnel. He lit the fuse and hurled it toward Marcus, expecting the explosion to end the fight decisively. Marcus caught the bomb in midair. For a heartbeat, the entire yard held its breath. The fuse was burning down, maybe 3 seconds left before detonation. Any sane person would have thrown it away, tried to minimize the damage. Marcus Kane wasn't sane. Not anymore. He held the bomb steady, let the fuse burn down to nearly nothing, then hurled it back at his attackers with the accuracy of a trained grenade launcher. The explosion caught 2 men directly, sending them sprawling across the concrete with severe burns and shrapnel wounds. The remaining attackers broke and ran, their courage shattered by the impossible sight of someone using their own weapon against them. Even Victor, the supposed leader, took several steps backward, his face pale with shock. But Marcus wasn't finished. He walked toward Victor with measured steps, his clothing torn and bloodied, but his movements still fluid and controlled. The Russian tried to draw his own weapon, a curved blade that looked like it had been professionally forged outside the prison. Marcus was done playing games. When Victor lunged forward with the blade, Marcus moved like liquid lightning. He caught the Russian's wrist, twisted it backward until something snapped, then drove his knee into Victor's solar plexus with enough force to lift the larger man off his feet. Victor collapsed, gasping and broken, his weapon spinning away across the concrete. The entire yard watched in stunned silence as Marcus stood over the fallen leader of the Aryans. 8 men had attacked him with weapons and military coordination. Now 7 were unconscious or fleeing, and their leader was sobbing on the ground with multiple broken bones. Marcus leaned down, grabbed Victor by his shirt, and pulled him close enough to whisper. But this time, his words carried across the silent yard, heard by every witness to the carnage. "I am not your enemy unless you make me your enemy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But if you ever threaten me or mine again, I won't be so gentle next time." He released Victor, who collapsed back onto the concrete, and walked away without looking back. The yard remained frozen in shocked silence for several long moments before erupting into chaos as guards finally moved in to secure the scene. By evening count, the entire prison had heard the story. Marcus Kane, the quiet guy who read philosophy books, had just single-handedly destroyed the most dangerous gang in Millbrook. But more than that, he'd done it with a level of controlled violence that spoke to training far beyond anything the other inmates had ever witnessed. The balance of power in the prison had shifted permanently. The Aryans were broken, their leadership hospitalized or transferred to other facilities. The other gangs watched Marcus with a mixture of fear and respect, uncertain how to approach someone who'd proven capable of such devastating efficiency. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. For the first time since arriving at Millbrook, he felt something approaching peace. Not because he enjoyed violence, but because he'd finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. Marcus Kane was a weapon, forged by years of classified operations and tempered by personal tragedy. Prison hadn't broken him or reformed him. It had simply given him a place where his true nature could exist without apology. And that realization would change everything about how the rest of his sentence played out. The war for Millbrook Correctional had begun, and everyone now understood that the quiet man in cell block C wasn't just another inmate. He was something far more dangerous. So there you have it. Marcus Kane walked into Millbrook Correctional as just another number in the system, but he became something else entirely. The thugs who thought they'd found easy prey discovered they'd awakened a sleeping giant. Tommy's crew learned that reputation means nothing when you're facing someone who's seen real combat. The Aryans found out that numbers and weapons are useless against someone trained to turn chaos into calculated destruction. What started as simple prison bullying became a masterclass in why some men should never be underestimated. Marcus didn't just survive the attacks against him. He completely rewrote the rules of power inside those concrete walls. Every gang leader, every tough guy, every predator in that place now understood one simple truth. The quiet man reading philosophy books was the most dangerous person they'd ever encounter. The lesson here isn't about celebrating violence. It's about understanding that some people carry skills and experiences that go far beyond what meets the eye. Marcus Kane's story reminds us that you never really know who you're dealing with, and sometimes the person who looks like the easiest target turns out to be your worst nightmare.